There is a photograph taken in 1919 that almost no one has ever seen. It shows a locomotive, massive, low-slung, surrounded by engineers who look not proud, but terrified. One of them is covering the serial number plate with his hand. Within 6 months of that photograph being taken, every official document mentioning this machine had been reclassified. Its test results vanished from the Railway Board's public registry. 3 of the engineers who built it would later claim, under oath, that it never existed at all. But it did exist, and what it could do shook governments on 2 continents. Most people, when they think about the great machines of the steam era, picture the glamour locomotives, the Flying Scotsman, the Mallard, the big boy lumbering across the Utah salt flats with a mountain of coal behind it. And these are the locomotives history chose to remember. They have plaques, museums, documentaries. Their measurements are memorized by enthusiasts the world over. Their records are carved, almost reverently, into the permanent record. History did not choose this machine. Someone chose for history. The locomotive in question was built under a provisional military contract in the Austrian Empire in 1917, at a moment when the war effort was consuming steel, coal, and engineering talent at a rate that left almost nothing for civilian infrastructure. The Austro-Hungarian rail network was collapsing under the weight of troop transports, and supply chains stretched to breaking point. Lines that had been designed for moderate freight were carrying 3 times their rated capacity. Bridges were failing. Axle loads were being exceeded daily. Engineers were patching problems with wire and improvisation and prayer. Into this chaos, a small team of locomotive designers, working out of a secondary workshop in Wiener Neustadt, rather than any of the prestigious main facilities, proposed something radical. Not faster, not more elegant, more efficient, in a way that no mainline locomotive had yet managed to achieve at scale. Their design used a form of compound expansion that had been theorized for decades, but consistently dismissed as too mechanically complex to be practical. In compound locomotives, steam from the boiler passes through a high-pressure cylinder first, does its work, and then, rather than being vented to atmosphere, is fed into a second, larger low-pressure cylinder to extract a second round of useful energy from the same steam. In theory, this dramatically reduces coal and water consumption. In practice, most compound designs of the era suffered from synchronization problems, uneven power delivery, and maintenance nightmares that made them deeply unpopular with running crews. The Wiener Neustadt team solved these problems. Not elegantly, their solution was mechanical, intricate, and demanding in terms of manufacturing tolerance. But it worked. Their prototype, designated internally as the Type 80 VN, demonstrated fuel consumption figures in controlled testing that were, by any honest reading of the data, extraordinary. On a measured run of 200 kilometers, with a loaded freight consist of 1,200 tons, it consumed 31% less coal than the best standard locomotive then in service on the same route. 31%. In a war being fought partly over fuel supply, that number was not just impressive, it was strategic, and that is where the story stops being about engineering. The armistice came in November 1918. The Austro-Hungarian Empire dissolved almost overnight into a collection of new and competing nations, each of which had their own interests, their own debts, and their own relationships with the Allied powers who were now dictating the terms of European reconstruction. The Treaty of Saint-Germain-en-Laye, signed in September 1919, placed strict limitations on Austria's industrial capacity. Rolling stock, locomotives, and railway infrastructure were subject to allocation and control. The victorious powers were not interested in discovering that a defeated nation had spent the final years of the war quietly engineering one of the most fuel-efficient mainline locomotives ever built. There were other interests at play too. British and French locomotive manufacturers had emerged from the war with overcapacity and hungry order books. The prospect of a continental design that offered 31% better fuel economy on a design that could be licensed and replicated was not welcome news in certain boardrooms. Industrial competition after the First World War was not fought only with patents and prices. Influence over Allied reconstruction committees was a very effective weapon. The Type 80 VN's test documentation was first restricted to a classified engineering review board. Then a fire, conveniently, destroyed the secondary workshop in Wiener Neustadt in March 1920. Two of the senior engineers emigrated, one to Brazil, one to the United States, where he worked for a regional railway company in Pennsylvania until his death in 1947. The third, a man named Leopold Gruber, stayed. He spent the rest of his working life in a mid-level administrative role at the Austrian State Railway, never again involved in locomotive design. In 1937, a railway historian named Hans Pemmer came across a reference to the Type 80-5N in a footnote of a procurement ledger that had survived the fire. He began asking questions. He found Leopold Gruber, then in his 60s, who agreed to an interview but arrived with a prepared statement declining to discuss his wartime work. Pemmer published a short article in a specialist journal. It generated almost no response. 2 years later, Austria was annexed. Pemmer's research files were lost. The trail goes cold there for 30 years. It was an American academic, a railway historian named Thomas Kincaid, working at the University of Pennsylvania, who picked it up again in the 1970s. Kincaid was researching compound locomotive development in Europe when he encountered Pemmer's 1937 article in a library archive in Vienna. He tracked down the Pennsylvania engineer, the emigrant, through employment records, only to learn the man had died in 1947, but the engineer's widow had kept his papers. In a cardboard box in a house in Allentown, Pennsylvania, Kincaid found carbon copies of original test data, handwritten notes in German, and a series of technical drawings that had never been published anywhere. Kincaid spent 5 years working through the material. His conclusion, published in a 1978 academic paper that received polite attention and no mainstream coverage, was blunt. The Type 80 VN had been deliberately suppressed. The fuel efficiency figures were real. The design was sound, and the reasons it disappeared had nothing to do with engineering. The numbers, when you sit with them, are stunning. A 31% reduction in coal consumption on the 80 VN would have translated, across a network the size of the Austrian rail system in 1920, to roughly 40,000 tons of coal saved annually. At 1920 fuel prices, that was a staggering operational saving. Scaled to the major European networks, German, French, British, the implications were almost impossible to calculate. The locomotive industry's entire post-war order book was built on the assumption that fuel consumption figures would remain broadly static. A design that shattered those assumptions wasn't just inconvenient. It was dangerous. There is a particular kind of erasure that doesn't require burning all the documents. You restrict access, you reclassify, you ensure the people who know stay quiet through persuasion or economic pressure or the simple arithmetic of exhaustion. The Type 80 VN didn't need to be violently suppressed. It just needed to be made inconvenient enough that no one with the resources to revive it had a reason to do so. Kincaid's 1978 paper has been cited 11 times in 46 years. 11 times. The Mallard's top speed record has been referenced in hundreds of thousands of documents. There is a version of history that gets written by the winners of wars. There is another version, perhaps less discussed, that gets written by the winners of markets. The Type 80 VN is a ghost in both. It is worth asking plainly what would have happened if this locomotive had entered widespread service. The practical answer is that it might have accelerated the evolution of compound technology by 2 or 3 decades. The more complex answer is that it might have forced the entire locomotive industry to reckon far earlier with efficiency as a primary design criterion rather than power or speed. The 20th century's love affair with brute force mechanical performance might have looked different. The calculus of coal, of carbon, of industrial consumption, it might have bent in a slightly different direction. We will never know. Because in 1920, in the chaos of a broken empire and a redrawn map, a machine that worked beautifully was quietly made to disappear. The photograph is real. It was found in a private collection in 2009 and authenticated by 3 separate historians. The locomotive in it is partially obscured by steam, and the winter light is flat and grey. But you can see the shape of it, lower than you'd expect, longer, with a cab that looks almost modern against the era it came from. And there is that engineer, his hand flat against the serial number plate. He knew even then that something was being buried. The history of engineering is not always the history of what worked best. It is, more often, the history of what survived the politics of its moment. The Type 80 FEV-N did not survive, but the carbon copies in that cardboard box in Allentown did. And that means the story isn't quite finished. What else is sitting in a box somewhere, waiting?